The dissertation found actually a positive link between sales performance, so the ability, of advisors to perform in clients, to retain them, to get referrals, and their emotional intelligence scores. So it seemed to me actually that emotional intelligence is a trainable ability. It's not like, say, IQ or personality, where it's sort of fixed or maybe fluid depending on sort of, your take on personality. But emotional intelligence, everyone can improve with training, regardless of their baseline.
Welcome to another episode of Talk FS. Talk FS is designed for professionals entering or in the financial services industry, such as financial advisors, mortgage advisors, paraplanners, and business owners. Talk FS aims to offer insights and guidance by interviewing key individuals from the industry, exploring their career paths, challenges, and successes. Today, I'm joined by James Woodfall, chartered financial planner, author, and founder of Raise Your EI. James brings a unique blend of technical expertise and deep psychological understanding developed through a career that began in banking, progressed through an advisor academy, and ultimately led to running and later selling his own financial planning firm. While building his business, James wrote his first book and completed a dissertation in emotional intelligence, sparking a fascination with the human, emotional side of financial advice. This journey led him to create Raise Your EI, a training company dedicated to helping advisors and firms translate psychological science into practical soft skills that strengthen client relationships, communication, and decision-making. In today's conversation, we'll be exploring why emotional intelligence is one of the most overlooked skills in financial services, how emotional intelligence-led training is reshaping advisor effectiveness. James, thank you for joining me and welcome to the podcast.
That's all right. Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to this.
Fantastic. Myself as well. And I'm hoping for myself, I'll be learning some stuff today about emotional intelligence and then be able to take it away into my own role. I'm really keen to explore what is emotional intelligence, what led you to emotional intelligence. But first, let's just have a little overview of your journey from cashier right through to running your own business and then later exiting that. So give us a little bit of a flavour as to your earlier part of your career.
Cashier, yeah, that takes me back. Yeah, that was a job I did. I think back in, I can't remember when, I was about 19, I think, something like that. In branch, and that was my entry into working in financial services. And I probably did that for about, I don't know, maybe about sort of 9 months to a year, I think. And fascinating job. I was just, I suppose, before we get to kind of diving into emotions, I actually had a little thought the other week about. I was putting together some content on emotion and memory and the link between, the reason that we remember, our long-term memory is stored of emotional moments or things that are emotionally significant. It's like you don't really remember what you had for breakfast last week, unless of course you're like in the habit of eating the same thing every day, and you're like, well, I know it's porridge because I always eat porridge. But you don't really remember the experience of sitting down, say a week ago and having breakfast, because it's just not significant or salient. But emotions are one of the factors which cause things to go from short-term memory to long-term memory. And I remembered, I remember very little of actually kind of, that kind of year of, say, of being a cashier. And actually one of the things that kind of do stick with you is those kind of emotional moments. And I remember really, really strongly, probably one of the most vivid memories I have of that is of this guy. He was probably, I'm going to say, 80 plus, coming up to the counter and describing to me how his wife died, I think probably about 6 to 12 months previous, and that he'd been trying to recreate some of the recipes from her own cookbook that she kind of kept and made notes in, and that he couldn't get them, he couldn't reproduce them so that they tasted the same way that when she made them. And he burst into tears and sobbed in a bank in front of a total stranger. I just thought, for me, I hadn't remembered that, until recently. And I just thought, that's, even from very early on, kind of starting in financial services, those strong experiences of the fact that when you deal with people and you deal with people, especially around finance, you can't, their personal lives are kind of intertwined with that. And so, I thought I'd share that just because it was something that popped into my head. I said the other week, and I just thought, wow, I can't believe I remember that. But of course, it was emotionally significant because, very, in that moment, I felt, real sort of, real strong sense of, kind of empathy with, with the chap in front of me. But then I suppose after I did the cashier role, I went and worked for Barclays Wealth, and that was doing something totally different. I actually did investigated missile complaints. So from all of their sort of book, going back through sort of like Barclays Life and then the Woolwich, if you remember the Woolwich, it sort of used to have an IFA business that Barclays then acquired. So it's my job basically to sit down. People still complain like they've been missold an endowment. I'd have to sit down and investigate that. It was usually true. For those listeners who remember endowments, they'll know that's absolutely the case. The Barclays had an advice arm called Barclays Financial Planning, and so that was basically branch-based advice. So advisors in branches, seeing clients in the branch. They had an academy, or they launched an academy, and I think I was one of them. I think on the first intake when they launched it, the academy was something like you did sort of 6 months of training, shadowing advisors, and then you went through their kind of sort of T&C scheme, and then you were, off and running in a branch or sort of handful of branches in my case that they kind of allocated you to. But I actually did my qualifications before I joined the academy. I did them when I was doing the kind of complaints investigation role, not because I had to as part of that job, but because I'd already kind of seen, forward in my career that I wanted to be a financial advisor at some point. And just, I think, through doing what was CFA, Certificate for Financial Advisors, that was the kind of minimum requirement pre-RDR that we used to have. But I think purely by doing that off my own back, funding it myself, passing the exams, again with the qualification, it made me stand out. And that's, I think, one of the big factors of me actually being successful in getting through that kind of academy application. The other thing that kind of happened was the kind of the manager, or sort of the divisional director for the kind of complaints team. For some reason or another, she decided to pick me up one day, put me in a meeting room, and just go, right, what is it you want? I was like, it's a bit of an odd question. And she's like, where's your career going? And she really put the pressure on and just put me on the spot. And I just kind of blurted out. She said, right. I said, look, I want to be a financial advisor. And she said, right, come with me. And she marched me down to the other end of the building to one of the area directors for Barclays Financial Planning was sat. And she just plopped me in front of him and just said, James wants to be a financial advisor. Can I have a chat with him? And it's one of those things that, I think, why sort of mentoring, is, as, I think so important within businesses. And, why I think if you run a business, or you're senior in a business, if you spot, people who are, engaged and want to move forward, that you don't hold them back. You pull them aside, and, you sit them down, and you help them process sort of through their thinking. So I think without that huge kick up the backside, I don't know when I would have made that happen. So I think it was, I was pretty lucky in that.
When you were in the complaints role, what made you think of taking your qualifications when you weren't asked to for the role, and potentially, by the sounds of it, you didn't even know the academy existed at that point? What led you to decide, I'm going to go get my qualifications off my own back here?
No, the academy didn't exist. I think when I was a cashier, the advisor who was in the branch, was really good. He was really energetic. Like, he was someone that you'd kind of look up to, clearly successful. And I think that was something that, I kind of sort of gravitated towards. He was a bit of a role model, and I just thought, that's a role that I want to do. So doing those exams, if it hadn't have been the Barclays Academy, then I was looking around. I think, I can't remember who I spoke to, but I was looking around for other kind of routes in. But actually, the interesting thing is that I do remember that I was getting the door kind of slammed shut in my face, because most of the time people say, well, have you done the role before? You say no. And one of the other things I remember, actually, just thinking about it, I spoke to two area directors. One of them was in Barclays. One of them was very supportive and went, yeah, let's put you on it. The other one sat down and started putting up barriers. And he's like, well, yeah, you haven't, done this before. So, what makes you think you can? I think what we need to do is put you in a branch and you be a personal banker, opening up bank accounts and, processing credit card applications for a year, see how you get on that, and maybe we'll talk. And I was like, no, I'm not going. That's not where my career's headed. Like, I'm not going to take a role over there just because it kind of ticks that satisfies your agenda. That's your agenda driving it. Not mine. So, it's lucky that I spoke to two thinking about it. But yeah, one was prepared to hold me back, and the other one was just prepared to see what potential I had.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, good job you did speak to two there. And fast forwarding a bit, you started your own business at 28. Now that's quite rare in the industry. Obviously, the average age of a financial advisor still remains in its 50s, and we're not seeing enough young financial advisors in the industry even today, let alone someone who's a financial advisor and started their own business. So you must have been in a very niche part of the market there. What gave you the confidence to go out and do it?
So I think Barclays Financial Planning shut down. So I was made redundant probably only after maybe two to 3 years of being an advisor. So it's one of those things, you got called into a hotel for a meeting, not knowing what it's about. And there's literally 100, I was in a room with like 100 plus people who were told, right, you're out of work. You're all on gardening leave for the next 6 months, go home. You don't need to come to work. You don't need to do anything. We'll pay you for 6 months, but you get money at the end of it, but you're done. And so that was a bit of a shock. And I went and got another job pretty much within about, I don't know, less than a month. I got offered another job as a financial advisor at HSBC. And it's funny, when I joined HSBC, about a year later, the same thing happened. Into a hotel, business is being restructured, we're getting rid of people. But they didn't close down their financial advice business, they restructured it. So I actually ended up staying they had basically IFAs within the business. It's IFAs, but it was the old sort of basically multi-tied effectively. So I effectively had sort of within my first 5 years, two redundancy situations, which was quite odd. So I was with HSBC for I think about 4 years in the end. And then I think the role that I had was quite limited. So I basically was looking at either going into discretionary investment management or going into private banking was what I was thinking at the time. So I did a couple of different exams. I did private client investment advice and management, which that's through the CISI, because I was talking to the kind of private bankers, and they said, "Well, that's the kind of benchmark that we need." And again, because I've been successful getting onto the BFB Academy by having the exams before, having the exams already before, and kind of using that as my foot in the door to get the role. I thought, well, I know that works, so just do it again. And then I spoke to the discretionary investment managers, and they said, well, we have the CISI, what was then the Chartered Wealth Manager qualification. So they're like level 7, that program. So I did, and that was kind of where I thought I was headed. But then effectively, I think the role I was doing, I was becoming more and more qualified and, kind of upskilled in terms of technical knowledge about what types of advice I could give. And actually the proposition at HSBC was very narrow and quite restricted. And that became quite frustrating, is that I had all this extra kind of capability of things that I could be doing for clients, but I just wasn't able to because of the situation that I was in. So then there was this little bit of a disconnect. It was just sort of like, well, am I doing the best for these people if I know that they've got all these other planning needs which need to be fulfilled and I can't fulfill them? Because I don't think my kind of manager at the time would have been a fan if I had said, you need to go and speak to a proper advisor who can go and do all these things for you. So yeah, it was one of those kind of moments where you just think, well, how am I going to put myself into a position where, one, I've got control, that I'm not going to get called into a meeting room and lose my job, at a moment's notice again. And two, that I've got full control over how I look after clients, ensuring that I can do the best for them across kind of all the planning areas that need meeting. That's the only logical, conclusion with that is if you look at kind of the broader market, actually most of the financial services professionals who are kind of let's say authorized, it's always been a kind of a small to medium, business environment. There's lots of IFAs are small business owners. handful of people in the business. And that's the bulk of the market across the country is, most people, if they work with an advisor, it tends to be kind of a small business. Of course, fast forward, 15, 20 years later, there was kind of consolidation, growth of networks, for example. I don't know whether that's still the same, but I remember it when I read the stats. This is going back a long time ago, but it's probably something like 70%, was kind of small businesses, and 30%, employed, with larger firms. I don't know if that's the same now, whether that's shifted over time, but it kind of, it makes you think, well, look, what's everyone else doing? Well, most people who stick around, in this profession long enough, if they want to progress their career, there becomes a moment where they either say, where they have to answer the question, do I want to be a business owner? And I think for me, that came, when I was 27, 28, and the answer was yes. And it was probably one of the scariest decisions I think I've ever made, because financially I was not ready. I didn't have tens of thousands of pounds in the bank. It was hard work that first year, really hard work. But it worked. And I think the thing is that you really know what you're capable of, when you make the decision and you put yourself into a situation where you have no other choice other than to get on with it and make it work. And I think that in itself, I think, is a lesson which has stayed with me, is that when I know something is actually, kind of a significant decision, which I suppose is probably going to improve, my life, my family's life, it usually, usually you have that sort of feeling in your stomach of real risk involved. And that's emotion. That's interoception, your perception of feelings within the body. And that is your emotions saying, look, this is significant. This is a big decision. This is something that you need to pay attention to. Whenever I've kind of had that feeling, it's usually led to big payoffs down the line. So I listen to it. I think you call it like, gut instinct or listening to your gut. Actually, I've learned to pay attention to that, and just think, actually, what's it telling me? Because your emotions are there to, to give you information. We think with kind of the logical part of our brain a lot, but actually our emotions, they're doing a job as well. So the better that you can kind of, read those signals within your body and just think, well, why is this significant? What is it about this decision that's causing a different reaction than me just thinking through it logically and going, yeah, I know what I need to do. But actually, I think, taking the plunge and setting up a business, was incredibly difficult, but it's unbelievably rewarding.
Yeah, fantastic. And you mentioned the emotions stay with you. What were some of the key highlights from running the business where you really recall them because you had strong emotions from those memories?
What comes to mind actually is that, but actually I think that the biggest things that are kind of highlights for me is achieving milestones in the business. So when you set out, kind of a series of objectives for yourself, and then you hit them. But in order to make sure that it is a highlight, you need to really do a good job of celebrating those milestones as wins. And actually, that's one of the things which sees you through some of those bad moments and stressful times. If you've got, like, I don't know, if you do sort of like a sort of journaling habit, or you've got like a goal tracker book, somewhere where you can refer back and say, well, what did I say at the beginning of the year I was going to do? What were my goals for the beginning of the year? You look back and do your year review. You say, well, how many of those did I achieve? Sometimes I've gone back through some of my old journals of goals that I wrote 5-10 years ago that were like blue sky thinking. If things went unbelievably well, I would have done this and this. I'll read them back and I go, actually, I did that, and I'd forgot that I'd written it down. So some of those things I think are always good wins. There's some of the things which are always kind of highlights is that when you win, kind of big cases, that's always good. That's always quite a nice feeling. When you've got like probably a big case, which is, I don't know, a large amount of funds under management, that's kind of outside of your sort of average case size. It's always quite a good feeling when you get those, because you're always a bit kind of apprehensive beforehand, about, is the client going to go ahead? Are they going to, choose a different option? And then when they say, yeah, actually, no, we want to go ahead, you do get this sort of feeling of achievement that, that comes with that. So those moments are always quite good.
Fantastic. So in the intro, I've discussed your interest in emotional intelligence. What was the spark and the catalyst behind that for you?
I wouldn't say I was interested necessarily in emotional intelligence. I think that kind of was a discovery later. What I was really interested in was how to be a better financial planner. So my business had kind of a proposition where we did financial planning work for clients. So cash flow modeling, and we did pre-advice reports that we charged for. So we charged for financial planning as a service before we implemented any sort of products or recommendations post that. And actually, the focus of that one was that how can we deliver the best experience for clients? And actually, one of the things which really stood out is that in order to provide a great financial planning experience for clients, you need a different skill set than just being a financial advisor. Because I think the way that I was taught, when I worked for say Barclays or HSBC, is you give out your business card, you go through your terms of business, you fill out a fact find, you write a suitability letter, and then you present a key features document to a client. It did nothing about that. It teaches you to be highly competent. That's the way that T&C schemes are. They teach you to be very good at taking clients from analyzing a situation, looking at what opportunities are there, presenting those opportunities, in a justified suitability report, and then the client makes a decision about whether they proceed or not. None of that really prepares you to be a financial planner, I'm afraid. It's a very different skill set, because to be an effective financial planner, you have to have the confidence, competence to be able to ask planning-led questions. So to be able to sit down with a client and go, if you wake, 2 a.m. in the morning, what is it that's keeping you awake and going through your mind, with your finances? To ask like really thought-provoking things to get to the heart of what matters to people with their money. Because it turns out that the answers to, questions about what people value, you then need to be able to translate those into goals and objectives. You need to clearly, define them, and then in a way that you can build a kind of a financial plan using cash flow modeling tools. So you need the blend of kind of coaching skills, and the confidence to be able to sort of, challenge, when, or sort of pick up on assumptions, or clients, or sort of, thinking, which isn't maybe accurate within clients. So you need a very different skill set, and there's not a huge amount of training within that. So I kind of made the decision. It's like, well, in order to get really good at this, I've got to go and learn how to do it properly. So I did a coaching diploma. So I did a level 4 executive coaching diploma probably about 6 years ago. And that was really good in terms of sort of elevating sort of skill set. I took about 4 months, I think, to do that. But after that, as one of the things which was in that was talking about different levels of listening. So about quite often when we're talking to people, we listen to respond. So the other person's speaking, and while they're speaking, we're sort of half listening, but the other half is our brain going, right, well, what do I want to say next? And we're formulating, a point or argument that we want to make. Then you've got a different level of listening as a coach, where really you're listening to understand. So you're quietening down that voice internally, and you're paying far more attention to the person that's sat opposite you. And when you start practicing this, you realize how much more fatiguing meetings get. If you do an hour and a half meeting and you're intently focused on every word that the person is saying, you come out of the meeting and you think, I'm absolutely knackered, because it's cognitively demanding. Just a little side step. I'm doing a challenge in 2028, and the chap that I'm doing it with is my teammate. Well, I was talking to him about calories that the brain consumes, and I said to him, "Well, how many calories do you think when you use when you run a marathon?" And he said, "Oh, about 5,000, 6,000." I said, "Well, yes, about 7,000 calories." And I said, "How many calories do you think you burn, if you were to say someone sat down to do a chess tournament for a day?" And he said, 2,000. I said, "No, it's the same, 7,000 calories." So your brain consumes, it uses glucose. It takes glucose out of the blood. The food that you consume, your brain, utilizes energy from food for the activities that that it does. So if you undertake cognitively demanding tasks, it is fatiguing, and it can be as fatiguing as as exercise. So that's that was a bit of a learning point about actually how if you do financial planning properly, you can't have 5 meetings a day or 7 meetings a day like I used to have when I worked for Barclays. You can really only have about 2 or 3 quality meetings a day max, before it's just too tiring. unless you have a lot of Red Bull, but that's very good for you. So I remember listening to this sort of discussion about, well, how do you, about listening levels. And then level 3 was about picking up on what's going on in the room and what the client's not saying. But they didn't really say how to do that. So just by chance, I stumbled across a master's degree in communication, behavior, and credibility analysis, which was a 2-year part-time master's program, which looked at forensically how to understand behavior in real time, or from, recorded material. So what I mean by that is it forensically meant it was, minute. Sitting down and analyzing, say, taking an hour to analyze a minute of like recorded video of someone and being able to pick up all their different changes in the muscles in the face, to understand emotions in facial expressions, to be able to interrogate all of the words they were utilizing, look for things like when they were utilizing, language that was implying things. Then, looked at understanding body language, so gestures and tension in the body, understanding how the nervous system works. And then it also covered things like criminology, investigative interviewing processes, and being able to detect whether people were telling you the truth or not. So this was like a 2-year program about real deep dive into understanding behavior. At the end of that, you spend 6 months doing a piece of original research. So one of the things which I studied was emotional intelligence, because that's one of the modules that was covered. And it turns out that if you want to be a good, say, investigator, or a good behavior analyst, you need a high level of emotional intelligence, because our emotions leak out through our behavior. We can't control it. Emotional responses are quicker than the thinking part of the brain. So they're sort of frontal part of the brain. Emotional areas of the brain are deeper and lower down. So they're sort of about here. They sit closer to the brainstem. The actual sort of frontal parts of the brain deal with logical thinking, cognition, and it's slower. So when you take information into the senses, if it's going to create an emotional reaction, the emotions act quicker than the thinking part. So it changes how we interact with people, and it changes our kind of how we express ourselves through our words and through our behavior. And if you know what you're looking for, then you can catch those. And if you know how to understand them, then you can start really sort of seeing into how people are thinking, not what they're thinking, but how they're thinking. And that can be really useful in terms of improving how you communicate. So you need a high level of emotional intelligence to be able to do that, because part of emotional intelligence is actually the ability to perceive and understand emotions in ourselves and others. So I mentioned, earlier in that anecdote about this internal sort of feeling, pit in your stomach, when there's sort of significance or risk involved. That's part of emotional intelligence, is being able to perceive and understand what that is. So being able to perceive it, which is actually noticing it, being able to label it, and being able to think, well, what does it mean? And then the other part of emotional intelligence is doing that in other people. So, for example, if something was significant, for you, then I might see changes in your body posture. I might see muscle tension. You might not be aware of those unless you've got a very deep, unless you've practiced, you've done a lot of, say, mindfulness, and you're very, very in tune with kind of those changes, within your body. You're very in tune with perceiving them. But I'm trained. I can pick up on those, and notice those changes within your nervous system. So I've got a better understanding that actually, if I'm sitting there as a financial planner and I ask a client a question and they get a reaction, I know actually that the answer to that question, or the question itself, is significant, for the client. And that's important information. So that was the kind of first master's I did. And effectively the dissertation was looking at the link between that skill, which is emotional intelligence, and job performance in financial planners. So I put a range of financial planners through an emotional intelligence assessment, and then I correlated those scores on that assessment with things like their sales performance, client retention, referrals. But interestingly, emotional intelligence assessments are designed to get an understanding of how good are you at perceiving emotions in others and yourself, and then acting on that information, and then utilizing that intelligently. And actually the dissertation found actually a positive link between sales performance, so the ability, of advisors to perform in clients, to retain them, to get referrals, and their emotional intelligence scores. So it seemed to me actually that emotional intelligence is a trainable ability. It's not like, say, IQ or personality, where it's kind of sort of fixed or maybe fluid depending on on your take on personality, but emotional intelligence, everyone can improve with training regardless of their baseline. So it seemed to me that actually you've got that kind of a scientific basis for performance improvement, which I thought was an opportunity within the financial services profession, because there isn't really anything which is kind of filling that gap of high quality science based training that's on the same level as kind of those technical skills that every advisor has to go through, in terms of getting a diploma, getting chartered. There's nothing that's equivalent in understanding client behavior, client psychology around money. So that I thought was the opportunity, and that was the thinking behind setting up a training business to do that. I did another master's last year in psychology to kind of broaden out kind of understanding about about behavior in generally. But I think understanding both disciplines has been really helpful. So having the experience of being a practitioner has helped me interpret the research far better than had I just done that, kind of on its own. It's helped me understand the role of the planner as well,
Mm.
especially that kind of financial planning piece. So I think, actually, again, learning doesn't stop. I suppose that's kind of what you might have picked up.
Yeah, that is fascinating. That I think it's fair to say that on behalf of a lot of the listeners, we all would make an assumption that there's a link between, if you're able to listen to a client and interpret what they're saying well, you probably will do well at your job and have good performance. But the fact there's a scientific link there is quite interesting. And I love the fact that you spotted that opportunity to see there's a gap in the market where financial planners need to consciously seek out more understanding of how they do that, because I imagine a lot of them do what's been natural or self-taught to an extent, but it's then how can you take that base layer to a much more intermediate advanced layer where ultimately they're hopefully going to be listening to their clients better, which gives hopefully then the clients better outcomes. What is it you typically find when you have a cohort of financial planners that might be misconceptions that are kind of the first ones you may need to dispel, if there are any?
Well, I think one of the things which I suppose is a big misconception is what emotional intelligence is. I think the kind of approach I've taken with with discussing it and kind of my sort of content online is actually not to use emotional intelligence as a term, because I think what it does is it means that people who kind of read it, they've got a layperson interpretation or definition of it. So I think I've used terms like science of soft skills, because it makes it easier for people to understand what it is. So I think one of the misconceptions is that around what is emotional intelligence. But to be clear on the definition, I've said this already. It's an ability. So it's a trainable skill. I could sit down a cohort and I could train them to recognize emotions in people's behavior, and then help them interpret what are the processes which are going on behind the scenes within people's sort of bodies and brains, which are influencing how they might be thinking and interpreting information. So it's a trainable skill. But that in itself doesn't lead to performance improvement. You need to go and do something differently. You need to practice it. You need to put it into practice. You can give people the information, but they need to go and, next client meeting, they need to actually utilize that knowledge and turn it into skills and then new habits. So, and the other thing I think with emotional intelligence, which is probably a bit of a misconception, is that, well, it's not a misconception, there's good reason for this. Generally, one of the findings in psychology that kind of applies broadly is that we're all poor judges of our own behavior. So the kind of reasons for why we do certain things are hidden from us. So we don't always have the level of self-awareness and insight to be able to judge where our kind of current ability or skill set is at the moment. And obviously we're all biased and we think we're great. So we're very poor at rating ourselves and judging our own abilities. Slightly better at judging it in other people. So I think once you kind of describe what emotionally intelligent behavior looks like, people can kind of go, right, I know someone like that. So and so is, that has that skill or ability. But those are probably the two common things is actually, what is it? And then what's our kind of baseline in terms of, where are we now? But there are tools and measurements. So you can do an emotional intelligence assessment and it gives you a good idea of what your current baseline is.
Now, normally a question I would ask there is, from you seeking out this learning and having been a financial planner, what were the upsides to you? But I think off the back of what you just said there, what are the things you've heard from financial planners you've worked with as to what they've recognized? Because if people can see things in other people, it's probably better to ask that question than what did you see for yourself?
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, actually, the problem is, and especially look, the problem is that when you're a financial planner and then you study, say, behavioral finance or any sort of behavioral science where you understand decisions under risk or kind of psychology of kind of emotions of decision making, then when you come to make decisions about your own money, you second guess yourself all the time because you're trying to like analyze yourself and interpret your own behavior and you're dealing with your own logic and emotion. So you've almost got like this, I don't know, professional handicap because you understand it more. It's harder to deal with. So I think personally, it's an ongoing journey. Personally, I'm now far more aware of my own emotional responses, and I've got the tools and strategies to control them. But what you have to appreciate with emotions is that they are hardwired responses. And what I mean by that is that the way that they work is that they all have kind of universal themes to what triggers them. And even if you've got knowledge and expertise around what those are, you can't turn them off. So, you still get frustrated, you still get angry, you still get scared, you still experience sort of sadness and you can't control what triggers them, but you can get better at recognizing it and then managing it, which I think, and it's the managing it part, which I think is so key for the kind of advisor role because it's so cognitively demanding and, not dealing with emotions causes problems later. I mean, if you remember, I was saying about the brain consuming, sort of large amounts of calories, for doing tasks. Well, actually, part of that financial planner role, is dealing with emotion. And so we actually allocate part of our cognitive resources to emotional processing. And that's kind of sort of a broad term because it's one of the things that we do with emotions is we initiate them, and we can suppress them, and then we can also, sort of reflect on them. And so we need kind of an outlet for that. Is that if you kind of have a day, for example, where you're dealing with lots of, emotional events in clients' lives, do you remember I said about sort of that story about the chap at the counter and that, he was there, a guy in his 80s sobbing isn't something that I would have been exposed to. You think, he's highly vulnerable, and that shocked me a little bit. I felt a reaction in my body, and that's because that's how empathy works. Is that you see someone distressed, you start to pick up on that, and you mirror that state. Even though that emotion is not mine, it's his. I feel that. Now, if you extract that towards, throughout the day that you're having multiple of those kind of interactions with clients, highs, lows, it means that actually part of your cognitive resources are allocated to processing other people's emotions. And so if you don't deal with that, it can accumulate as stress, which is, again, something that I'd experienced in my career as well, is that I wasn't aware of that. And actually, I didn't have an outlet for these things. Obviously running a business, you kind of carry a lot more than that as well. And so actually stress and burnout's a real risk, within the profession. When I'm training kind of other advisors, one of the things which I suppose is they really like is just understanding that, emotions are universal. So just understanding what emotions are. So what are the categories? What triggers them? How does that change thinking and behavior? And then instantly they can, thinking back through experiences that they've had previously, or they think of clients, friends, family, colleagues, whatever it is, interactions. And then they go, that's why that happened. So I'm giving them the tools to be able to interpret, experiences, and then the skills to be able to do that in real time in the future.
And I would love to get your take, and I know I'm changing of tack here a little bit, is with the rise in technology and for financial planners who are beginning to incorporate some automated elements to their workflows, whether that's a meeting being recorded, meeting summaries being written for them, what's the risk that's potentially on the cards here for financial planners, where if there's going to be an element of automation being brought in to help create efficiencies, which is a positive element to enable everyone to work a bit, more fluidly, where will the potential emotional intelligence and the listening element get lost in the process? And if you feel that is the case, what could a financial planner do to try and minimize and mitigate the loss there?
Well, the opportunity, I think there's two things. There's an opportunity, but there's with that brings complacency, which is the risk.
Okay.
So if we're on a Zoom call, for example, versus live face-to-face with a client and a notepad, if you're face-to-face with someone making notes, you have to be, you're really attentive to them. You're listening intently. You might sort of look down just to scribble a quick note here and there. But you're intently listening. You're picking up on their behavior because, you're face-to-face with them. You can see their entire body. And you've also got, although that, I said emotional intelligence is a trainable skill, we have, senses. We're taking in, information all the time. We have parts of our brain that process that and are very, are evolved to recognize cues of emotion. So we do this naturally anyway. Training just makes you, slightly better at it. And because you're bringing it, you're actually bringing it to, front of mind and you can understand what it is that's going on. So the risk of kind of, I think the opportunity, I think with, is the fact that, potentially you haven't got to sit there making notes. So you can, increase your attention on the client because you just think, well, I haven't got to worry about, sitting there and being interrupted. Sorry, can you just say that again? You haven't got to do that, which means that actually there's an opportunity for you to be more attentive, and to ask better questions and better follow-up questions, and provide better summaries, to ensure that you really understand the client's perspective. The risk is complacency. Is that because there's a piece of technology listening, you just think, well, I don't really have to listen because I could just listen back to the recording or not even listen to the recording. I can just read the, five actions that are summarized from this conversation. So I think that's the risk. The risk is that complacence and laziness. And actually that what their large language models are kind of good at is kind of sort of pattern recognition, and they can do transcription. They can extract points from a transcription and quite neatly create an email. But what they're not very good at is the human bit. So I described when I was talking about how I study behavior analysis. I talked about the face. I talked about the nervous system. I talked about the body. None of that's captured by AI. It just captures words. And so all of that's gone. It doesn't even capture tone of voice, because it's literally just the words. Extracts words from the audio and then utilizes the written word to do all the rest of its tasks. So it doesn't get tone, it doesn't get stutters, it doesn't get pauses, it doesn't get intonation, exclamation. So it misses out vast amounts of data, which actually when we're face to face with people as humans, we have access to it and we use all of that, whether consciously or not.
I totally agree with you there in terms of the opportunity and the risk. It is interesting, and I think we're going to be in a state of transition for many financial planners. And as you've said earlier on in our conversation, E&C schemes are set out to help you undertake the technical element of the role. And actually, this is where there's more and more need than ever for the soft skill element of not only understanding your clients more, because clients have access to more information. And so you need to unpick some of the layers of that they've been accumulating prior to sitting in front of you. But also with the change in way you operate, you also need to be more conscious of how to listen better. The fact you're not having to take scribble notes down. Do you see it as an opportunity to go, okay, I can, as you said, exert more energy into the conversation because I'm able to, and also, not get caught in that complacency negative spiral, because anyone who starts becoming complacent, normally it spirals the wrong way, doesn't it? Until you hit quite a big point and go, right, I need to pull myself out of here, really. So I'm in a lot of agreement with you. What other sort of takeaways have you got on the topic? And I know it's quite a deep topic, and we're we're only touching the surface here. But what advice or tips would you have for someone listening?
I think probably one of the things which has been most useful for me is reading. So reading good books that help you develop this, help you develop some of these skills. I think there's yeah. I mean, I'm trying to think of what I could what I could specifically recommend. I think probably one of my favorite people at the moment to read is Carl Rogers. So Carl Rogers was he was a psychologist, a therapist, and he wrote some very good books about his kind of method. I'm trying to think what my favorite one is here, on becoming a person. So that's it's on my bookshelf here. So Carl Rogers on becoming a person. I'd say read that. Actually, it's a really good sort of introduction into, well, not an introduction, but it will get you thinking about the type of conversation style that you need to have to be able to really understand someone's perspective. Because actually that's part of what Carl Rogers did is throughout his career, working with people, was to they'd come, he was a psychologist, and people come to him with problems, and he understood that part of the role within that is to facilitate thought in the person that you're talking to. And that's interesting, isn't it? So, do you do anything differently as a financial planner? No. People come to you with some sense, of what it is, a problem, something that they think they need doing. But really, if you take this approach that you want to be curious, and that you see your goal of the interaction is to the best that you're able to understand that person's perspective, you start asking questions in a way that helps you do that. And actually, what also happens as well is that by asking those questions, you help the person you're interacting with clarify their thinking, because they take something from sort of a fuzzy, general, vague, feeling, and then they're now talking to someone asking them to articulate that in a way that they might not have done before. So I think financial planners, Carl Rogers is quite a good author to read if you want to kind of understand how you do that. He's very good at giving summaries as well, and also sort of picking up on when people have kind of made assumptions, which again is quite a good skill to have.
Yeah, you've got me intrigued there on that. And now the flip side of that is you mentioned reading has really helped you. You're an author, you've written some books. How has that process of putting your thoughts to paper assisted you?
Yeah, I would strongly recommend that everyone who's kind of interested in developing, sort of their soft skills, if you read, then you should write, because I think what happens with books now is the kind of world we live in is highly distracting all the time. It just is, and so I think you can pick a book up, you read a little bit, you look over at your phone, you Google the thing that you've just read, and then you kind of get back to the book and you just think, where was I? And then maybe you've sort of lost where you were. And so I think there's too much sort of distraction, which I think takes away from people really kind of getting insights out of things that they read. So I think there's a couple of things which kind of help with that. If I buy a book now, I also listen to the audiobook at the same time, because it basically, I'm processing it, by reading it, but then I'm processing it through another sensory pathway, which is audibly. So I'll tend to read both, and then I'll make notes as I go along. So, and I'll maybe pose questions and just think, well, what is it about this that, applies to the work that you do, and try and answer that. So that actually then what I'm doing is that I'm thinking critically about what I'm reading. And what that does is it improves kind of the retention of what you're reading, but also helps you kind of digest and understand the material. Now, the downside of this is that it takes longer to read a book. So the answer is that you don't read bad books. You have to be ruthless that if you start a book and you're not enjoying it, that you don't think, right, I'm gonna see this through to the end in case it's good. Don't stop. That's one thing I've done within the last 3 years. Is just I used to just put like start a book and I'd be like, I'm going to read this to the end just to see if it's good, and I get to the end and be like, what a waste of time. You haven't got time to read bad books. So I'd say, but writing, or while reading's quite key, but writing in generally, and I'm not saying that you have to kind of publish, but getting into the habit of maybe writing, 500 to 1,000 words a week. which sounds like a lot, but it's not when you sit down to do it. And you can do it professionally. You can do it as a personal blog, personal journal. You could open up, a folder with a series of Word documents and just week 1, week 2, week 3. If you did that for a year, you'd have a book. You'd have 52,000 words, which is a book. But actually, part of the reason why I say doing it is that, writing is thinking. Discussing ideas with people, that's also kind of a process of, thinking. So dialogue is another form of thinking. And so I think it just makes us, better at whatever we do. We spend time actually, thinking, get away from the distractions, turn the TV off, turn the phone off or get it out of the room and, do it properly, pay it the attention it deserves. So I think for me, having written books as an author, I think, we've been doing this for 55 minutes. I could sit here and talk to you for I could sit here and talk to you for the rest of the day about emotions and psychology. Because when you sit down and you have to put your thinking into writing, you really have to kind of clarify your ideas. And it's hard to do, but it means that you understand the topic far better. You've got deeper level of expertise, when you have to sit down and put pen to paper.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a brave choice to start writing. I can see a lot of procrastination in it. I'm thinking about myself there when you're talking, and I know some people who do journal, and I've seen the benefits of them having weekly, daily reflections. So I do urge you to try it, even if you're a little bit hesitant, because I know people who have done it. I'm yet to go on that journey myself yet, but I think I hope to one day.
Well, just do it.
Simple as that, really, isn't it? Sometimes just do
Have
it.
you got an empty notebook laying around the office?
Yeah, I think I do actually.
There you go. Just go out, take yourself out for coffee at lunch, and just sit down and fill a page with whatever comes to mind, and then you're done. You started.
Yeah, that's the biggest hurdle sometimes, isn't it? The first
Get going.
page. Fantastic. Now, I've talked about your books. James, if those listening today want to explore this further, where can they find more information?
Okay, so so I wrote a book called The Heart of Finance, which is an emotional intelligence, book for specifically for financial planners. It's available where you can buy books, so Amazon, bookshops. But if you've got, say, like Audible or Spotify, subscription, the audiobook's available as well. Or if you go to my website, for the business, which is raiserei.co.uk, you'll get a little pop up that says, if you want to sign up for the email list, that you'll get a PDF copy of the book sent to your inbox. So I do a weekly email as well, which is just things which are kind of top of mind for me, things which I think are useful. I know, so from feedback, a number of the subscribers on that, they find actually that sort of weekly, sort of cadence of, on a Friday, me dropping up in their inbox, just a few words, to get them thinking is a worthwhile read as well. But those are the main things, really. I mean, I'm on LinkedIn, I post quite regularly there. But I'll probably say the weekly email is probably sort of my favourite thing that I do. So yeah.
Fantastic. Well, we'll make sure there's links to those in the description box below for those who wish to explore it further. James, thank you for today's conversation. It's been interesting. It's been helpful and healthy for me to start thinking about my own way I approach things and making sure that I do try to develop that listings further as well. I think, like you said, everyone needs to continue learning at all points. So it's been really interesting. And thank you for joining us on the podcast.
No, you're welcome. No, thanks for having me on.
Fantastic. So to those listening, thank you very much for listening. We do hope to continue to deliver fantastic conversations like we had today. So please do subscribe to get notified of the future episodes.